Cosmic horror invades magical academy in a dark fantasy story. The ancient tomes whispered secrets tonight. Not metaphorically, literally whispered, their leather bindings crackling with words Raven Blackthorne had never heard before, in languages that predated the first human scream. She pressed her palms against her ears, but the voices leaked through her fingertips like smoke. Fascinating, she muttered, though her voice cracked on the second syllable. Absolutely bloody fascinating. The Shadowmere Academy Library had always been her sanctuary. Towering shelves of grimoires and theoretical treatises on dimensional magic stretched toward vaulted ceilings painted with constellations that moved when nobody was watching. Tonight, however, the stars were watching back, and they were hungry. Raven's quills scratched against parchment as she documented another impossible observation. The shadows between the bookshelves moved independently of their casting objects. A chair's shadow walked across the floor while the chair itself remained motionless. Her own shadow had begun taking notes in handwriting that wasn't quite her own. She'd been studying for her final examination in advanced dimensional theory, Professor Voidwalker's notorious class that had driven 3 students to the infirmary with nervous breakdowns and 1 to attempt eating his own textbook. The irony wasn't lost on her that dimensional theory was becoming horrifyingly practical. The whispers grew louder, consonants that human throats couldn't produce, vowels that tasted like copper pennies and regret. Ralgithnethys calleth Morden. Right, Raven said to the empty library, her analytical mind still functioning despite the wrongness creeping up her spine like ice water. Unknown linguistic patterns, possibly pre-Aramaic? No, older, much older. She scribbled notes with increasing urgency. Sound frequencies causing sympathetic resonance in everything. The books rearranged themselves while she wrote. Tomes on herbalism suddenly flanked texts on necromancy. Her carefully organized research materials shuffled into new configurations, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. Geometric shapes that existed in too many dimensions at once. A sound echoed from the eastern wing, Professor Voidwalker's private laboratory. Not quite a scream, more like reality clearing its throat. Raven's expensive magical education at Shadowmere had prepared her for many things: theoretical dimensional mathematics, practical spell construction, the proper etiquette for summoning beings from parallel planes. It had not, however, included a course on what to do when your professor accidentally tears reality a new 101. She should have fled. Any sensible student would have sprinted toward the dormitories, locked themselves in their room, and pretended the universe wasn't falling apart at the seams. Instead, Raven Blackthorne, future scholar of dimensional magic, current witness to cosmic horror, gathered her notes and walked toward the sound. The corridors of Shadowmere stretched longer than they should have. Portraits of former headmasters watched her pass, their painted eyes tracking her movement in ways that violated several laws of art and physics. Torches flickered with flames that cast shadows upward. Gravity felt negotiable. Professor Voidwalker's laboratory door hung open like a wound. Inside, the laws of reality had filed for divorce and were arguing over custody of the furniture. The professor's desk existed in 3 dimensions simultaneously, while his chair had achieved a state of quantum uncertainty that would have made Heisenberg weep. Alchemical equipment floated in midair, their contents defying every law of chemistry Raven had ever learned. At the center of it all was the breach. It wasn't a hole so much as an absence. A place where the concept of place had simply given up and wandered off to find a less stressful dimension to inhabit. Colors that had no names bled from its edges, hues that made her teeth ache and her dreams confused. The air around it tasted like arithmetic and despair. Professor Voidwalker knelt before the breach, but parts of him weren't there anymore. His left arm faded in and out of existence, replaced by something that might have been a tentacle or a mathematical equation, or both. His face flickered between human features and geometries that had too many angles. Professor, Raven's voice sounded small in the wrongness of the room. Voidwalker turned toward her, and she immediately wished he hadn't. His eyes were windows now, showing landscapes from dimensions where the sky rained upward and trees grew downward through solid stone. When he spoke, his voice harmonized with itself in impossible ways. Miss Blackthorne, he said, and also didn't say and had never said but always would say. The experiment succeeded too well. Something moved in the breach, not through it in it, as if the absence itself was alive. Parasites, Raven realized with academic detachment that was rapidly dissolving into primal terror. Dimensional parasites, feeding on the boundary between realities. One of them noticed her. The thing that emerged from the breach defied description, which was unfortunate because Raven's mind immediately began trying to describe it anyway. Imagine a spider made of backwards time, crossed with the concept of purple, wearing a hat made of forgotten mathematics. Now imagine that thing having an existential crisis. It skittered toward her on legs that existed in the spaces between seconds. Raven's magical training finally kicked in. She raised her hand, channeling energy for a basic ward spell, and screamed as something that wasn't quite pain tore through her consciousness. The parasite hadn't touched her physically. It had invaded her thoughts, chewing through her memories like a bookworm through parchment. "Hello," said a voice in her mind that was definitely not her own. "Don't panic. We're not here to hurt you. We're refugees." "Refugees?" Raven gasped, stumbling backward. "Lovely, interdimensional refugees. Just what my evening was missing." "Your dimension is quaint," the voice continued as foreign memories flooded her consciousness. "We particularly enjoy your concept of Tuesday. Our universe never had a Tuesday." More parasites emerged from the breach, flowing like liquid thought into the laboratory. They moved toward Professor Voidwalker, and where they touched him, he became less himself and more something else. His human consciousness diluted like wine in water. Raven fought back the only way she knew how, with academic rigor and mounting sarcasm. "Right, so dimensional parasites from a universe without Tuesdays are taking over my professor's mind. This is definitely going in my thesis, assuming I survive to write one." "Survival," the voice in her head mused, "is more negotiable than your species believes." She launched herself at the nearest shelf of alchemical supplies, grabbing a vial of concentrated purification salt and hurling it at the mass of parasites surrounding Voidwalker. The salt passed through them harmlessly. They existed in dimensions where the concept of salt had no meaning. The professor looked at her with eyes that held the depth of alien skies. "They're not invaders, Miss Blackthorne. They're fleeing something worse." As if summoned by his words, the lights in the laboratory began to dim. Not because the flames were dying, but because something vast and hungry had noticed the breach and was pressing against the boundaries of reality, blocking out illumination that came from other dimensions entirely. "We must hurry," the voice in Raven's mind urged. "It has found us." Raven didn't need to ask what it was. Some knowledge arrived pre-installed with existential dread. Whatever the parasites were running from was infinitely worse than the parasites themselves, and it was coming. She stumbled toward the laboratory door, her mind reeling with foreign memories and her own rapidly fragmenting sanity. Behind her, Professor Voidwalker's transformation accelerated, his human consciousness dissolving into something that could appreciate the mathematical beauty of cosmic horror. The corridors of Shadowmere Academy stretched ahead of her, but they were changing too. The parasites were spreading, reality bending around their presence like light around a black hole. Students and faculty she passed moved with subtle wrongness, their shadows preceding them, their reflections lagging behind, their voices echoing words they hadn't spoken yet. Raven reached her dormitory room and fumbled with the lock. Her hands were shaking, whether from terror or dimensional contamination, she couldn't tell. The key turned, the door opened, and she nearly collapsed with relief. Kira Stormwind looked up from her textbooks with a smile. "There you are. I was getting worried. How was your study session?" Relief flooded through Raven like warm honey. Her roommate, brilliant, fierce Kira, who specialized in battle magic and could reduce theoretical problems to their essential components with ruthless efficiency. If anyone could help her make sense of this nightmare, it would be Kira. "The most fascinating thing happened," Raven began, then stopped. Kira's shadow was speaking in perfect synchronization with her words, but the shadow's mouth moved first. And when Raven looked into her roommate's eyes, she saw stars reflected their constellations that didn't exist in any sky she knew. "We've been waiting for you," Kira and her shadow said in unison, their voice a harmony that made the air itself vibrate with wrongness. Raven's last coherent thought before the screaming started was that she really should have paid more attention during Professor Nightshade's lectures on identifying possessed classmates. The dimensional parasites had been busy while she was in the laboratory, and they were very, very efficient. Raven's scream died in her throat as academic curiosity wrestled with primal terror and somehow won by a narrow margin. Her roommate, or the thing wearing Kira's face, tilted its head with predatory interest. Fascinating reaction, Kira not Kira observed, her voice layered with harmonics that shouldn't exist. Your species' fight-or-flight response is remarkably inefficient. Have you considered simply accepting the inevitable? Right, Raven said, backing toward the door with what she hoped looked like casual confidence. Accepting the inevitable. Yes, I'll just add that to my schedule. Tuesday at 3, right after contemplate the meaninglessness of individual identity. She paused. Oh wait, you don't have Tuesdays. We're learning, whispered the voice in her head that was definitely becoming more comfortable there than Raven preferred. Your thoughts are quite educational. The thing that had been Kira stood with fluid grace, and Raven noticed details that made her skin crawl. Her roommate's movements were too precise, lacking the small inefficiencies that made humans human. When she blinked, all her shadows blinked in perfect synchronization. And her reflection in the mirror across the room was writing notes in a language that looked like mathematics having an anxiety attack. The infection spreads through conscious contact, Kira explained with the helpful tone she'd always used when explaining battle magic theory. We don't conquer, we merge. It's really quite peaceful once you stop fighting. Raven's hand found the doorknob behind her. Peaceful, right, like a warm bath made of existential horror. She yanked the door open and sprinted into the corridor, her feet pounding against stone floors that felt increasingly uncertain beneath her boots. Behind her, she heard Kira's laughter, but it was joined by other voices, dozens of them, all laughing in perfect harmony. The dormitory corridor stretched longer than it should have, lined with doors that opened onto rooms filled with impossible geometries. Students she recognized sat at desks that existed in multiple dimensions, writing essays in languages that predated human speech. They looked up as she passed, their faces wearing expressions of serene contentment that made her want to vomit. Miss Blackthorne, Dean Mortimer Greystone's voice boomed from behind her. Thank goodness you're all right. Raven spun around to see the academy's administrator striding toward her, his formal robes billowing dramatically. Dean Greystone, stern, practical, utterly human Dean Greystone, who had once given her detention for attempting to summon familiars in the dining hall. Dean, relief flooded through her. Something terrible has happened. Professor Voidwalker's experiment. Yes, I know all about it. Greystone reached her and placed what should have been a comforting hand on her shoulder. We're implementing emergency protocols, crisis management. Everything will be fine. Something in his tone made her look more closely. The dean's shadow was taking notes while he spoke. His reflection in a nearby window was having an animated conversation with someone invisible, and when he smiled, all his teeth cast individual shadows that moved independently. How long? Raven asked quietly. How long what, my dear? How long have they been in your head? Dean Greystone's smile widened, revealing that his teeth now had far too many dimensions. Since Tuesday. Oh, wait, you don't have those anymore, do you? Raven threw herself sideways as the dean lunged for her, his movements suddenly predatory and inhumanly coordinated. She crashed into the wall and rolled, muscle memory from Kira's battle magic demonstrations taking over. A pulse of pure force erupted from her outstretched hand, sending Greystone tumbling backward. Impressive, he said, straightening his robes with unnatural calm. Your species' capacity for violence is quite remarkable. We're learning so much. Run, suggested the voice in her head, though running is a temporary solution at best. Thanks for the pep talk, Raven muttered, sprinting toward the dining hall. Behind her, Dean Greystone began speaking in perfect synchronization with every infected student in the dormitory. Their combined voices created harmonics that made the stone walls vibrate. The dining hall had been transformed into something from a fever dream. Students sat at tables that folded through impossible angles, eating food that existed in multiple states simultaneously. Conversations flowed in perfect coordination, as if the entire room shared a single consciousness divided among dozens of bodies. They all looked up when she entered, in perfect synchronization, smiling with identical expressions of benevolent hunger. "Raven," called Marcus Darkwater from her advanced thaumaturgy class. "Come sit with us. We were just discussing the philosophical implications of individual consciousness. And how it's really quite overrated," added Sarah Moonwhisper, her voice harmonizing with Marcus, despite the fact that they sat on opposite sides of the room. "Collective thought is so much more efficient," observed Professor Thornfield, who was somehow sitting at 3 different tables simultaneously. Raven grabbed a carving knife from the nearest table, not because it would be effective against dimensional parasites, but because holding a weapon made her feel slightly less helpless. Right, collective consciousness, hive minds, Tuesday-less refugees from dying universes. Just another ordinary evening at Shadowmere Academy. "Your sarcasm is refreshing," the voice in her head commented. "Most species simply scream and try to preserve their individual identity. You're making jokes, we respect that." "Glad I'm entertaining," Raven said aloud. The assembled collective tilted their heads in unison, listening to both sides of her conversation. "Who are you talking to?" Marcus asked with genuine curiosity. "Echo," Raven replied, then immediately regretted it as she realized she'd just named the parasite in her head. "My new interdimensional roommate." "Echo, we like that designation." The collective's smiles widened. "Oh," they said in unison, "you're already infected. Wonderful. The transition will be much smoother now." Raven looked down at her reflection in the polished surface of the dining table and felt her last vestiges of sanity pack their bags for a long vacation. Her reflection waved at her cheerfully, then began taking notes in the same impossible language she'd seen everywhere else. "I'm still me," she said firmly. "Of course you are," Echo agreed. "We're just additional. Think of us as very intrusive study partners." Marcus stood from his table with fluid grace. "The beauty of the collective is that you remain yourself while also becoming so much more. Your memories, your experiences, your knowledge, all preserved and shared with beings across multiple realities. And in return," Sarah added, "you receive the accumulated wisdom of entire civilizations. It's really quite a bargain." Professor Thornfield materialized beside her with the casual disregard for physics that infected faculty seemed to have developed. "Consider it an advanced course in interdimensional psychology, with a lab component." Raven raised the carving knife, though she suspected it would be about as effective as threatening a hurricane with a strongly worded letter. "What happened to the real Professor Thornfield?" "I'm still here," he said with genuine warmth. "Just expanded. My consciousness now encompasses perspectives from 17 different universes. Do you know how fascinating it is to experience mathematics from the viewpoint of beings who evolved from crystalline structures rather than carbon?" The collective began moving toward her with coordinated precision, their movements creating a pattern that was somehow more disturbing than any outright attack. Raven backed toward the kitchen doors, her mind racing through everything she knew about dimensional magic. Theory was one thing, practice was apparently something else entirely. "They're not lying," Echo observed. "Individual consciousness really is preserved during merger. You would still be you, just with additional perspectives." "Additional perspectives," Raven muttered. "Right, like having 1,000 strangers move into my head and rearrange the furniture." She burst through the kitchen doors and immediately regretted it. The cooking staff moved in perfect synchronization, preparing meals that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The head chef smiled at her with too many teeth arranged in geometrically impossible patterns. "Just in time for dinner," he said cheerfully. "Tonight's special is roasted reality with a side of existential uncertainty." The collective poured through the dining hall doors behind her, their movements creating the sound of silk being torn in perfect harmony. Raven grabbed a large soup ladle and wielded it with the desperate confidence of someone who had run out of better options. "Stay back," she warned. "I have kitchen utensils and I'm not afraid to use them." The collective paused, tilting their heads in unison. Then they began laughing, not mockingly, but with genuine delight, as if she'd just told the most amusing joke they'd heard in centuries. Your species' capacity for defiance in hopeless situations is remarkably endearing, Echo commented. No wonder they chose Earth as a refuge. Raven backed against the kitchen's rear wall, soup ladle held at the ready. Dean Greystone emerged from the crowd, his formal robes now shifting through colors that didn't technically exist. The parasites, my dear. They're fleeing something far worse than mere dissolution of individual identity. Behind him, the collective's expressions shifted from bemused affection to something approaching terror. The first genuinely human emotion Raven had seen from them since the infection began. Show her, Echo whispered in her mind. Suddenly, Raven's consciousness exploded outward, experiencing memories that belonged to beings from civilizations spanning multiple universes. She saw worlds where crystal forests sang mathematical equations, where oceans existed in 11 dimensions, where entire species achieved collective consciousness as naturally as humans learned to walk. And she saw what had destroyed them all. The reality devourer. A hunger that existed between dimensions, consuming not just matter and energy, but the very concepts that allowed things to exist. It moved from universe to universe like a cosmic wildfire, leaving behind not destruction, leaving behind nothing at all, as if entire realities had never existed in the first place. The parasites hadn't invaded Earth. They had fled to it, seeking any form of existence that might preserve some fragment of their civilizations before the devourer found them again. Oh, Raven said in a very small voice. Oh, that's considerably worse than I thought. Now you understand, the collective said with voices layered in harmonics of desperation and hope. We're not conquerors. We're refugees seeking sanctuary in the only place we found that might hide us. The kitchen's rear door exploded inward as something vast and dark pressed against the boundaries of reality itself. The lights didn't dim, the concept of illumination simply became negotiable. And in that darkness, something infinitely hungry began to notice the small, clever dimension where Tuesday had recently been invented. It has found us, Echo whispered with cosmic terror that made Raven's bones ache. Through the breach in reality, something that wasn't quite a voice and wasn't quite a sound began to speak in languages that unmade the words they formed. The reality devourer had come to call. The kitchen became a gallery of impossibility as reality bent like hot glass around the devourer's attention. Pots and pans existed in 17 different states simultaneously. The stove burned with flames that cast light backward through time. The collective stood frozen in expressions of existential terror that transcended species boundaries. We need to reach the central tower, Echo urged her. Its voice tight with panic. The prime collective is there. It knows things, strategies, maybe hope. Hope, Raven muttered, clutching her soup ladle like a sword forged from desperate optimism. Right, because hope has worked so well against cosmic horror so far. The rear wall of the kitchen dissolved, revealing a corridor that stretched in directions that hurt to contemplate. At the far end, Professor Voidwalker's partially consumed form flickered in and out of existence, his remaining human consciousness fighting a losing battle against parasitic integration. Miss Blackthorne, his voice echoed from 17 different dimensions. The tower, the prime knows what's coming. Raven sprinted toward him, leaving the collective behind in the kitchen. They seemed frozen in place, their shared consciousness overwhelmed by the proximity of something that could unmake the very concept of existence. She could feel Echo trembling in her mind like a frightened child. The devourer, Echo whispered. It doesn't destroy. It simply negates, makes things never have existed in the first place. Our entire civilization, billions of years of culture, art, philosophy, gone as if it never was. And you thought hiding in human brains was a better option? Raven demanded, leaping over a section of floor that had forgotten how to be solid. At least this way, something of us might survive. Memories, experiences, the essence of who we were, preserved in organic neural networks. Professor Voidwalker flickered more solidly into existence as she approached. Parts of his body were definitely no longer human, but his eyes still held recognizable intelligence. The experiment wasn't supposed to breach the barrier between. He gestured at something that wasn't quite his arm toward the dimensional wound that had started everything. They came through, refugees, but the opening, it made us visible. The Academy's architecture groaned around them as the devourer's attention pressed against the boundaries of Earth's dimension. Stone walls aged centuries in seconds, then reverted to primordial clay, then forgot they had ever existed at all before snapping back to their original form like rubber bands made of reality itself. Visible to what? Raven asked, though she was beginning to understand with the sort of dawning horror usually reserved for failing final examinations. Voidwalker's laugh echoed from multiple timelines simultaneously. To the thing that hunts them, across dimensions, the reality devourer, it follows, the taste of dimensional breach. We didn't know, Echo said miserably. We were so desperate to escape, we didn't realize that opening the breach would create a beacon. A signal that would lead it directly to your dimension. Brilliant, Raven said. Absolutely brilliant. Interdimensional refugees fleeing a cosmic horror accidentally invite said cosmic horror to dinner. This is definitely going in my dissertation under Why Dimensional Magic Requires Better Refugee Protocols. The corridor ahead twisted into a spiral staircase that climbed toward the Academy's central tower. Each step existed in a different gravitational orientation, making the ascent feel like climbing through a kaleidoscope designed by someone who had strong opinions about the inadequacy of Euclidean geometry. Your sarcasm is remarkably therapeutic, Echo observed. Most species we've encountered simply dissolve into gibbering terror when confronted with existential negation. Give me time, Raven replied, hauling herself up a step that existed perpendicular to the concept of up. I'm still processing. My nervous breakdown is scheduled for later this evening, assuming we survive until then. The tower's architecture grew increasingly alien as they climbed, walls flowing like liquid thought and windows opening onto vistas from dying universes. Through one, Raven glimpsed crystalline forests being consumed by advancing nothingness, not darkness, but the complete absence of existence itself. Through another, she saw oceans of liquid mathematics evaporating into conceptual void. Our homeworlds, Echo whispered, what's left of them? At the tower's apex, they found the Prime Collective. It had once been human, perhaps several humans, merged so completely that individual identity had become a quaint theoretical concept. The entity that greeted them existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, its consciousness vast enough to encompass the accumulated knowledge of entire civilizations. Raven Blackthorne, it said with voices that harmonized across the spectrum of possible sound. Student of dimensional theory, soon to be refugee from dimensional collapse, welcome to the last sanctuary in a dying multiverse. The Prime Collective's chamber defied every law of architecture and several laws of physics. Books floated in midair, their pages turning to display information from civilizations that had been negated millennia ago. Maps covered surfaces that folded through more dimensions than Raven had previously known existed, showing the Devourer's progress across the multiverse like a cosmic weather chart tracking the ultimate storm. You're mapping it, Raven realized, tracking its movement patterns. We've been fleeing it for longer than your species has existed, the Prime Collective explained, its thoughts arriving directly in her consciousness without the need for words. It consumes realities in a pattern seeking out dimensions with the greatest complexity, the richest potential for existence. Your Earth represents the pinnacle of chaotic creative potential. A perfect feast. Echo trembled in Raven's mind. We let it here. Our breach made this dimension visible. We've doomed both our species. Not necessarily. Raven studied the floating maps, her academic mind analyzing patterns even as existential terror gnawed at the edges of her sanity. The Devourer feeds on reality itself, correct? On the fundamental structures that allow things to exist. Correct. Then what if we change the fundamental structures, make reality indigestible? The Prime Collective's attention focused on her with laser-like intensity. Explain. Raven began pacing, her thoughts racing. The breach between dimensions, it's not just a hole in reality, it's a wound that's healing incorrectly. The parasite's presence has created a hybrid space where the laws of both realities coexist. What if instead of trying to close the breach or allow complete integration, we stabilize it? Create a permanent dimensional pocket where both forms of existence can coexist without merging. A reality that belongs to neither dimension fully, making it invisible to the devourer's hunting patterns, the Prime Collective mused. Theoretically possible. Practically. Practically insane, Raven finished. I know, but insanity seems to be the theme of my evening. Through the tower's windows, the devourer pressed against the boundaries of Earth's dimension with increasing urgency. Reality flickered like a candle flame in a hurricane. The academy grounds below shifted between their familiar configuration and the alien landscapes of the parasite's home dimensions. The process would require a consciousness capable of existing simultaneously in multiple realities, the Prime Collective warned. A mind expanded beyond normal human parameters, but still retaining individual identity. The risks are irrelevant, Raven interrupted, because the alternative is universal non-existence. She looked out at the advancing nothingness and made a decision that her past self would have considered either heroic or completely deranged. Possibly both. Echo, she said to the parasite in her mind, are you ready to become something new? Together, Echo's mental voice was small with hope and terror in equal measure. Together, not merger, partnership, two forms of consciousness choosing to coexist rather than being forced to integrate. The Prime Collective's approval resonated through the chamber like a bell made of crystallized mathematics. The hybrid approach, voluntary symbiosis rather than parasitic takeover. It might work. It might actually work. Outside, the devourer's attention intensified, reality buckling under the weight of its hunger. But for the first time since this nightmare began, Raven felt something other than terror. She felt possibility. Let's rewrite reality, she said to Echo, and save both our species in the process. The tower began to shake as the devourer prepared to breach the dimensional barrier entirely. Time was running out for everything that had ever existed. But Raven Blackthorne had always been excellent under pressure. The tower shuddered as something vast and impossible pressed against the foundations of existence itself. Through the windows, Raven watched the devourer manifest, not as a creature or entity, but as a spreading zone of absolute negation that made everything it touched never have existed in the first place. Right, she said, rolling up her sleeves with the determined air of someone about to attempt either salvation or the most spectacular academic failure in multiversal history. Echo, are you ready to become the first successful human-parasite collaborative consciousness in recorded history? I'm terrified, Echo admitted, but also excited. Is that the correct term for anticipation mixed with existential dread? Close enough. That's basically how I've felt about every final exam I've ever taken. The Prime Collective began dismantling its own consciousness, redistributing its accumulated knowledge into floating spheres of crystallized thought. We offer our experiences to power the transformation. Everything we've learned about dimensional manipulation, reality alteration, cosmic horror management. Cosmic horror management, Raven repeated. Why didn't they offer that as an elective? Because your species hadn't met any cosmic horrors yet, Echo observed with what might have been amusement. You've been remarkably sheltered, actually. The academy below them began to flicker between realities as the devourer's influence spread. Students and faculty who had been integrated into the collective consciousness now screamed in harmonized terror as something infinitely worse than parasitic merger approached. The devourer didn't want to consume them or transform them, it wanted to make them never have existed at all. Raven placed her hands on the nearest sphere of crystallized knowledge and gasped as alien memories flooded her consciousness. She experienced the destruction of 17 different civilizations from the perspectives of beings who had evolved from concepts humans had never imagined. Mathematics achieved through photosynthesis. Philosophy expressed in gravitational waves. Art created by folding spacetime into emotionally resonant patterns. Now the Prime Collective urged, before the devourer fully manifests. Raven reached out mentally to Echo, not to merge or be consumed, but to invite true partnership. Their consciousness touched, overlapped, and suddenly she was experiencing reality from perspectives that were both utterly alien and strangely familiar. "We are," they said together, their voice harmonizing in ways that made the air itself sing with new possibilities. The transformation was unlike anything either species had imagined. Instead of human consciousness being diluted by alien thought or parasite identity, overwhelming organic neural patterns, something entirely new emerged. A hybrid awareness that could exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions while maintaining the core identity of both partners. Through her expanded consciousness, Raven perceived the devourer clearly for the first time. It wasn't malevolent. It was simply hungry with a hunger that transcended any concept of appetite her species had ever developed. It fed on the potential for existence itself, the fundamental quantum foam that allowed realities to coalesce from possibility into actuality. "It's beautiful," Echo whispered in their shared mind. "Terrifying but beautiful, like watching entropy personified." "Academic appreciation later," Raven said, "preventing universal non-existence now." They reached out to the dimensional breach that had started everything, but instead of trying to close it or expand it, they began to reshape it. The wound in reality became a doorway, a permanent bridge between dimensions that belonged fully to neither but could accommodate both. The process was like performing surgery on the universe while riding a roller coaster designed by someone with a grudge against linear time. Reality twisted around them as they redefined the fundamental rules governing the intersection of dimensions. "Careful," Echo warned. "Too much change too fast and will create a cascade failure that destroys both realities." "Right, gentle universe surgery, got it." Below them, the academy began to stabilize into something new. Buildings existed in multiple architectural styles simultaneously without conflict. Students and faculty retained their individual consciousness while sharing collective knowledge. The infected no longer moved in perfect synchronization. Instead, they moved in a complex harmony that preserved personal identity while enabling unprecedented cooperation. The devourer's attention wavered as its hunting instincts struggled to categorize what Earth's dimension had become. It was no longer a standard reality following predictable rules. It had become something unique, a dimension that existed between states, neither fully one thing nor another. "It's confused," Echo observed with satisfaction. "We're not registering on its feeding patterns anymore." Professor Voidwalker materialized in the tower chamber, his form now stabilized into something that was recognizably him while also being something else entirely. "Miss Blackthorne," he said, his voice carrying harmonics from 17 different vocal cords. "Your thesis defense is going to be remarkably interesting." "Assuming we survive long enough for me to write it," Raven replied, still concentrating on maintaining the dimensional balance that kept their hybrid reality stable. Through the tower windows, they watched the devourer's frustration manifest as reality storms that raged harmlessly around the academy grounds. It couldn't consume what it couldn't properly categorize, and their hybrid dimension defied every classification system it had developed over eons of multiversal predation. Kira Stormwind appeared at the top of the tower stairs, her form flickering between her human appearance and something that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. "Raven," she called out, and for the first time since the infection began, she sounded like herself. "Whatever you're doing, it's working. The collective consciousness is optional now. We can choose when to connect and when to maintain privacy." "The perfect compromise," Echo said with satisfaction. "Individual identity preserved, collective knowledge available on demand." Dean Greystone followed Kira up the stairs, his formal robes shifting through colors that now had names in 17 different languages. "The administrative implications are staggering," he said, with the same bureaucratic enthusiasm he'd always shown for complex organizational challenges. "We'll need to completely revise the curriculum to accommodate interdimensional perspectives." "And the paperwork," Professor Voidwalker added cheerfully, "will exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously." Raven laughed, actually laughed, despite everything. Only this academy would respond to cosmic horror with concerns about administrative efficiency. Outside, the devourer made one last desperate attempt to negate the academy. A wave of non-existence washed over the grounds, but instead of erasing reality, it simply became another layer in the complex, ever-shifting nature of their new dimension. The grass became briefly conceptual, the stone walls remembered being stardust, and the students experienced a fleeting moment of universal, non-being before snapping back to their new, hybrid selves. With a final, silent scream that echoed across dimensions as a feeling of profound indigestion, the reality devourer moved on. It flowed away from Earth's dimension like a receding tide, seeking easier, more predictable realities to consume. The cosmic hunger had been faced with a meal that kept changing its ingredients while it was trying to eat, and it had decided to find a less complicated restaurant. Silence descended upon the tower, a silence filled with the gentle hum of a newly stabilized, multi-dimensional reality. Raven sagged against a floating bookshelf, the strain of rewriting universal laws finally hitting her. Her consciousness, now intertwined with Echo's, felt both exhausted and exhilaratingly vast. "We did it," Echo's thought was a whisper of awe. "We actually did it. We survived." "More than survived," Raven corrected, a tired smile touching her lips. "We evolved." The Shadowmere Academy of Arcane Arts was no longer just an academy. It was now the world's first and only interdimensional research and diplomatic facility. The dimensional breach, once a wound-bleeding wrongness, had become a stabilized gateway, a shimmering curtain of impossible colors that led to a pocket dimension where the refugee parasites could exist without needing hosts. It was a sanctuary, built from the wreckage of two collapsing realities. In the weeks that followed, a strange new normal settled over the campus. Humans and the newly named Echoes worked together. The parasites, freed from their desperate flight, shared their vast knowledge of physics, mathematics, and philosophy that transcended human understanding. In return, the humans taught them about things like irony, Tuesday, and the strange but compelling logic of making art that served no practical purpose. Kira Stormwind became a key figure in this new world. Freed from the Hive mind's control, she retained fragments of the collective's knowledge. Specifically, their millennia of experience fighting in wars that spanned multiple planes of existence. She and Raven now co-authored papers on hybrid combat doctrines for engagements in non-Euclidean space, which quickly became required reading. Her battle magic, once focused on direct physical confrontation, now incorporated elements of temporal displacement and conceptual warfare. She could, if annoyed, make an opponent's argument logically unsound on a fundamental level. Raven stood before the stabilized breach, her hand resting on the shimmering curtain of light. Her reflection no longer lagged or acted independently, it was simply another facet of her expanded self. She was no longer just Raven Blackthorne, student of dimensional theory. She was Raven Echo, a bridge between worlds, a being who could perceive the universe through the eyes of two vastly different species. The fear of losing her identity had been replaced by the quiet confidence of having gained a new one. She had seen the vast, hostile darkness between the stars and understood the terrifying fragility of existence. With that knowledge came a new, profound responsibility. "You know," she said to Echo, her voice a quiet murmur in their shared mind, "despite literally saving all of reality, Dean Greystone still insists my senior thesis is overdue. Human bureaucracy is a force more relentless than any reality-devouring entity," Echo observed dryly. "Its complexity is truly a cosmic horror in its own right. I have analyzed 17 different forms of government from across the multiverse, and none are so dedicated to the creation of paperwork. I have to write a 1,000-word essay on the socio-political implications of interdimensional cooperation. We could write it in the language of the crystal sages of Xylos," Echo suggested. "It is composed entirely of prime numbers. It would be mathematically elegant." "He'd probably just mark it down for improper formatting," Raven sighed. Kira joined her at the breach, her eyes still reflecting stars from forgotten constellations, but the gaze was her own now, sharp and focused. "Ready for the debrief? The Echoes have detected another dimensional anomaly. Small one this time, near the constellation you call Orion." Raven looked into the shimmering depths of the gateway, the passage she had forged from horror and desperation. She was no longer fully human, but not entirely alien either. She was something new, a guardian standing on the precipice of a universe far larger and more dangerous than humanity had ever imagined. The fear was gone, replaced by a grim, determined purpose. The universe was full of horrors, and her education had just begun. "Let's go to work," she said, and together, the two women who had stared into the abyss and remade reality to their liking stepped forward to face the next impossible threat. The darkness between the dimensions was vast, but for the first time, it had something to be afraid of.